Right, thanks for that introduction, Kevin. So we'll move into the discussion part of the meeting. So I see a lot of people have got their cameras off. So in terms of if people want to intervene, they can make a point, a talking point, or ask a direct question. So depending on how it goes, it may be worthwhile just letting the discussion run for a while, or Kevin may want to come back directly. But so people who are on camera can just indicate with their hand, and people who are off camera just use the zoom icon, the hand up icon to indicate. So I've got an indication from Angela. If you just yeah.
Hi, comrades. I'm sorry, I'm actually in Kilmarnock in Scotland. I seem to have found myself in this. I just wanted to ask a bit more about. It's been my view that, and I've been to Ukrainian solidarity campaign meetings with Ukrainian trade unionists speaking from Ukraine, and also Russian trade unionists. And I'm just wondering, because I was thinking, well, my position would have been, well, surely it's about what Ukrainians want. The Ukrainian working class have been invaded. So the first thing is to get Russia out. They want, and we should be taking our lead from them. I just want to ask a bit more about the right to self-determination. When Lenin was talking about nations having the right to self-determination, Ukraine took that step. And I don't know, is there something I'm missing historically? Because Ukraine took that step. They wanted self-determination, that again, from years ago. And I just, I would also say that, it's a really good discussion. I hope this will be a really good discussion. That as socialists, we should be critical of all positions, but we should take our lead for the Ukrainian working class and support the Russian anti-war movement as well, just to see what people think.
Right, thanks for that. So as I said, we'll just let Kevin doesn't have to come back directly to that. So I'll just let the conversation develop, and then I'll bring Kevin in some later point. So again, I've got another indication from John. Just unmute, John.
Is that me?
Yep.
Right. Well, first things first. I'm sure we're all experienced in seeing war propaganda on the media, but I have never ever seen the torrent of universal messaging that's flowed out of the TV over this conflict. And I draw one conclusion from that, and that is that you've got this universal we must crush Russia message. And the message is there because there's no opposition. It's due to the extreme weakness of the left. And Kevin was talking about, where there's demonstrations. To a certain extent, that represents where there still is a left, like in Germany. In Ireland, they're really, for example, I've just read before the meeting started that the trade unions are holding a demonstration on Thursday. Stand with Ukraine outside the Russian embassy. So from that point of view, there's no equivocation. Now, of course, Ireland took 20,000 Ukrainians, or offered to take it, is in the process of taking. I think it took 400 Syrians. And it said it'll find housing for these people, where the crisis in Ireland for the past decade has been finding housing for the Irish. So there's a tremendous amount of hypocrisy, and there's sort of hidden concern, but it doesn't really have a political voice. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, what do we actually know about the Russian aims and intentions? Well, we know what they tell us, and they've said the same thing for a very, very long time. We want a settlement with Ukraine that doesn't involve NATO on our borders. They've been saying that for years, and they've been negotiating for years. Now, that's, as Kevin said, that's not grounds for invasion, but it is the context of this invasion. The third thing that we know for definite is that Russia has no intention of occupying Ukraine. We know that because the military boys who know what they're talking about come on and say, well, Russia can't do that because they haven't committed enough forces. They can't do it. They can't even occupy Kiev because they haven't committed enough forces. And if they haven't done that, that couldn't have been their intention, right? Their intention was to grab hold of the eastern bit, split the country so that the military counterforce would not be effective, and then try to dictate terms. Right? So people who talk, and these are people on the left who talk about the Putin Hitler moving on into Europe and seizing Europe. I wish I was smoking what they were smoking. You know, this is just raw sewage, right? So the problem is that in order to take hold of popular discontent, and the popular discontent will grow because, as people always say, the main enemy is at home. Ireland is rushing into NATO. Britain is ramping up its military budget, moving closer to the US, and bringing in all sorts of laws that will essentially delegitimize protest. So Assange is on his way to the US, and RT is a banned media station in Britain. And as Kevin again has said, we're going to pay for this big time, and people can't afford to pay for it. You know, they can't afford to pay the existing gas bills that they're about to receive. They're not going to be able to pay for bread if things go on. So those are all points, I think. But I think the other thing is, I think the left is in a state of collapse that it will not recover from. It'll have to be reconstituted some other way. The blather about an anti-imperialist position against great Russian imperialism, it has a direct historical link to Nick Cohen and all the crowd who got together and led a left charge to invade Iraq. It goes back as far as that, you know, a soft left that said, well, in this particular case, imperialism is progressive. It's going to be all right. It's going to save us from these monsters and maniacs. And the people who say that, they never come back. They never return. They turn out to be wrong. They never say they're wrong. They just retreat into liberal society and never say another word. And that's going to happen here. And the last thing I'd like to say is that, so we need to think sort of concretely about having an anti-war movement that's international. And the other thing we need to think concretely about is the theoretical basis of that. What's the theory? What do we have to argue about? And I would say, having read a person I have some severe contempt for, Gilbert Akar, I think what we're, you know, if you step back from Ukraine, what you see is a globe reorganizing itself. The Americans are trying to step forward. They've subjugated Europe to a certain extent in that they've got Germany to line up with them, even at great cost. And they're very, very clearly, they've built a ring around Russia, they've built a ring around Iran, they've been a ring around Venezuela, and above all, they've set up a ring around China. And they've done this over a very, very short period of time. Now, there are things that are unstable about that. Will Joe be there in a couple of years? If Joe's not there, will the next American president want to continue asserting European hegemony? Will the Germans and French be happy to accept an ongoing Pax Americana that they pay for? There's all these questions, but the starting point is the focus is not a sort of moral tick list. Oh, they're imperialist, they're imperialist, it's anti-imperialist. The issue is that we live in an imperialist globe. What has each section got to do with it, right? And for our little small bit of the world, what our bit has to do is to stop a big charge towards NATO. That's the main thing that's happening in Ireland.
All right, so I got another indication from Gerald. Yeah, just on mute.
Yeah. Just to make 2 points. When Kevin was talking about, people in Egypt not being able to buy bread and stuff like that. This crisis actually goes not just in terms of the staples. For example, in some countries in Latin America, we are seeing, for example, an increase now in things like eggs. Why? Because Ukraine exported its corn to these countries, corn that was used as animal feed for the hens in the battery farms, and the production of eggs. So all of this has gone up. Ukraine and Russia are also major exporters of agricultural fertilizers, et cetera, and other agricultural inputs that people can no longer get. And they have led to an increase in agricultural costs right across beyond just staples. Anyone who is getting their supply of corn or the supply of agricultural inputs from Russia or the Ukraine suddenly find themselves in a major crisis in terms of the costs of cost of living. And that's part of how capitalist agricultural production is organized around the world. It's highly unlikely, or I can't see the circumstances in which there's going to be a war with Argentina in the near future, but where that happens, the world supply of soya suddenly goes into crisis. And there's that model of specialization of agriculture around the world has led to a situation where any chink in the chain of production can suddenly cause major costs, and these costs go beyond the immediate product. That's put in jeopardy. It goes into everything else in which it was used. And we've had this has been going on for a long time in Africa. When there was wars around the Ghana region, the price of cocoa shot up, and countries all around the world took advantage of the war to increase their own production, which then collapsed once the war had been resolved, and these other countries could get back to their own production. This war actually gives us an opportunity, I think, to call into question certain models of production, not just-in-time production, in terms of at least agriculture. There is no reason why the world or anybody should rely on certain countries for basic products like wheat, corn, or soya. These specializations take place on a world scale in countries, but also then within those countries, that entire regions are given over to one product. And when there's a problem with it, and even if it's a natural problem like pest infection, suddenly world supply is thrown into jeopardy. On the other question that John was talking about, the Thomas from 20,000 refugees, they were actually at one stage talking of up to 100,000, but the government has sort of calmed down because they realised actually that their initial promise of 20,000 entails absolutely huge logistical problems for them. But it actually shown, though, that there's, because Ireland actually, despite being a net exporter of people for most of its history, has a really racist immigration policy. So what can we see is that, you can fast track people's professional qualifications to get them in. There isn't actually a technical need to have people in doing this for years. And also we can see that the direct provision that we have in Ireland, which is a glorified concentration camp, we have 7,400 refugees who've been in direct provision. Most of them spend an average of 3 years. Some of them spend up to 7 years in those direct provision centres when there was no need. because we can suddenly have, we've almost got nearly 10,000, I think, Ukrainians into the country, literally overnight, getting the qualifications recognised, being put up in houses and other stuff, and the government is pulling out all the stops, the housing. But they have done a costing on this, how much it would cost for every 1,000 refugees that they take, and they're willing to do it, and they're talking about hotels, which brings us back to the problem of housing in Ireland. The money has always been there to solve it, there just wasn't the will. And I think now that the Ukrainians are coming in, and it's a bit difficult to make some of these arguments without sounding racist or sounding that you're saying things like there's no room at the inn. There is room at the inn. The problem is that the government has never wanted to solve these problems before, and they're not actually going to solve them. These are stopgap measures just not for refugees. These are stopgap measures for just this particular cohort of refugees. The 7,400 people who are in direct provision are going to continue in direct provision, and anybody coming from any other part of the world to Ireland is going to continue go into the direct provision system. So it's an opportunity actually to challenge our refugee policy and also our housing policy, because when there's a will, they're quite willing to take over hotels and pay for them for people who have nowhere else to live. And Kevin, would probably not be aware of this, but in Ireland, the housing crisis is such that at any one point in time, there was a maximum for about 1,500 properties for rent in the entire state. That's how bad the housing crisis is.
All right. I've had a couple more indications, but I'd like to bring Kevin back at this stage because those early interventions raised quite a few points and also a number of questions. So, Kevin, would you like to come back on what's been raised so far?
Yeah, sure. Just quickly, Jonathan, so others get a chance to come in. I thought what all the contributions were really interesting. What Jared just said, I think he's right. Wherever we are, this is because this war has come, and we haven't even none of us have referred to it yet. I wouldn't say after the COVID crisis, but kind of during the COVID crisis, during this phase of the COVID crisis. And that itself raised huge numbers of questions along the lines of what Joe was saying, that why is society organized like this? If it's more sensible to work from home for certain occupations, why do we do that all the time? Why do people who clearly are valuable paid less than the bosses who obviously aren't? All of those things. And now we have this crisis, which is raising all sorts of fundamental questions. One of the things that you touched on, Joe, is that about rationally reorganizing production on a world scale to make it, I think the usual phrase that's used now is more resilient. Now there's kind of a socialist way of doing that we talk about and that you outlined. There's also increasingly a capitalist approach to that, because they're worried, by they I mean particular states, giant corporations, elements of the imperialist, competitive imperialist system, are worried about securing the supply of all sorts of things. I mean, you suddenly find when these things happen that the Ukraine produces a gas called xenon, which is one of those gases that doesn't interact much with anything else, but is very important for the atmosphere to producing semiconductors and so on. And it is one of the world's major suppliers, and therefore there's a worry that semiconductor chips and so on, that production will go into crisis in a matter of weeks or months unless this supply is re-established. So the capitalist way of doing that is to try and grab hold of the resources to secure the supply lines militarily. So I think what we're going to see is an increase in that, and an increase in the direction of resource wars and controlling territory, a kind of a competition between a socialist solution and a more barbaric capitalist solution to the problem that's been exposed by the crisis over the last couple of years. I mean, I agree very much with what John said, and I don't think we should underestimate the impact that an Irish anti-war movement worthy of the name can have, because one of the big arguments about Ukraine, and it's raised, and it links on to what Angela's point was, it's connected to what lots of people in Ukraine themselves say, is the benefits of saying we don't want to be part of this imperialist game. Now, okay, there's a limit to that. You know, the world's imperialist powers kind of impinge on you, but you can politically assert and fight for your state to assert at least the military neutrality. And for an Irish anti-war movement to grow and promote that can be of great benefit, because there's a huge pressure. There's pressure on people in Finland, in Sweden, in Austria, all even in Cyprus, all countries that have not been part of NATO, to now say, okay, well, we'll have to go along with NATO because, you know, otherwise Putin will invade us, or something like this. So a strong voice of Ireland is very important. Well, on Angela's point, well, I think what you say is, of course, important about what people in Ukraine want. We have to understand that people in Ukraine are divided. I mean, there are very, very few people supporting the Russian invasion. But if you go back to 2014, in the west of the country, there were slim majorities for being part of the European Union. In the south and east of the country, big majorities against that, and big majorities against NATO. And it's not as simple as this, but it does slightly overlap with who is primarily a Russian speaker and who's primarily a Ukrainian speaker, but it's not quite as simple as that. But there is a big division, and there's a big division now, and that's probably what the aim of the Russian state operation is to amplify that division and to split the country, if not formally, then at least de facto. And that also, I think, impacts on the question of self-determination. I mean, you mentioned Lenin, who was and remains very famous for advocating the right of oppressed nations, especially, to self-determination, including Ukraine, because it had been forcibly part of the Tsarist Empire. But Lenin also made another point, which we shouldn't forget, which is during the First World War, he'd strongly advocated the independence of Poland, to be free to break away from the Tsarist Empire, as had Karl Marx, actually. But during the First World War, the German imperial setup established a puppet government in Warsaw, in Poland, and it said, "Look, we've liberated Poland from the Russians." And then he said, "This is not self-determination. To swap one imperialist master for another imperialist master is not self-determination." Now, I'm not drawing an exact parallel, but some of this is in play over Ukraine. Do you know what I mean? That we don't want to be under Russian tutelage, but nor do we want to be just a plaything of Western capitalism and Western imperialism. So that makes it a little bit more difficult, and it certainly makes it more difficult for Ukrainian socialists and working class activists who are trying to navigate this. And there you find that there are actually genuine Ukrainian socialists opposed to the Russian intervention, but also opposed to their own ruling class, who are facing repression by the Ukrainian government. So we should bear that in mind. I mean, I think there's a limit as to how much we can advocate a solution. I think the main thing is that we fight in our own countries to put forward an anti-war and internationalist position as best as we can to help create the space for people in Ukraine and in Russia and elsewhere to develop their thinking and their internationalism.
All right, thanks for that. So I'll just move back into the discussion again. I've already had a couple of indications. Firstly, Yetta, followed by Danny.
Yes, I'll take my starting point in what John said. I understand John's point as the inter-imperialist struggle and rivalry is now a more or less all-embracing fact of the international situation. And I think that looking at the war, I think it's actually three different wars taking place at the same time. It's the inter-imperialist war, which is on the Russian side, a hot war, on the US Western side, a Cold War, and and the line between these two are going right through Ukraine. It's sort of dividing Ukraine between the Russian and the Western imperialism, in one way, and the other war taking place is the Ukraine, the Russian imperialist war against the non-imperialist Ukraine. And the third war is the war of self-determination of the Donbass part of the country. So I think that this makes the whole thing very complex, of course, but that I think it also it raised a lot of questions and points, but I want to raise at least 2 points on this basis. One is that the question of delivering arms to the just struggle of the Ukraine people is to me, it has been very difficult question, because on the one side, of course, we want the people of Ukraine to win the struggle over Russian imperialism, and it's a legitimate struggle in that sense. On the other hand, more or less the only forces that can provide these weapons are the Western imperialism. And this means if we accept this delivery of arms, we get into a situation in which we advocate a proxy war between Russia and the US and NATO, EU. So the only way I think we can, it sounds a bit strange, but I think the only way we can manage this problem is to say we don't support arms from the Western imperialist. Whenever there's for instance, the EU now has provided 1 billion, I think, I don't remember the figure, but for arms for we do not support this, but we also do not go against it. I don't know if this makes sense to you. I think this is more or less the way we can handle this. We support the victory of we support their rights. We do not support weapons from the West. We do not go against weapons from the West. This is a bit tricky. So that was one point. The other point I'll make me short now, is that because of the nature of this war, this struggle, and this situation being on the generally a inter-imperialist struggle. In the anti-war movement, we should of course focus on the rights of the Ukraine people. This is clear, and not make it up in abstract, the inter-imperialist. But I think if this struggle is going to be part of our preparation for social revolution, which I think it should be, we need to give it an anti-imperialist nature. To do that, I think the only forces that can do this is the Trotskyists, more consistent Trotskyist left. So this gives us an immense task. And I want also to ask you, what do you think is sort of a useful basis for an anti-war movement? I mean, what are the main slogans under which we could operate? I think Russia out of Ukraine, no to Western interference. Yeah, I don't want to talk anymore. Sorry for being so long.
Danny?
Yeah, just a couple of points. I support Socialist Democracy's position on, you know, neither Washington or Moscow. Like it's a no-brainer, but it's very hard to come out with that position without being labeled pro-Putin. They'll always push you into that category if you kind of bring out the kind of hypocrisy and the antagonisms in it. But I think in the Irish anti-war movement here, there's been, but it was good to see there was a meeting on there of the Irish anti-war movement, and PAN were there, and there was a few groups, and I was well represented across there. But there is a group there, and it's quite a large group, is kind of very pro. There's nothing, they don't want to talk about the Maidan, or they don't want to talk about anything that went on since 2014 or before it even. And it's just the invasion, which is wrong, and we all accept that. But I think the strength in numbers, I think we have to kind of look out for people in Ireland and kind of build a broad front of the neither Washington nor Moscow, and look at the imperialist nature of it and build that broad front, because there is strength in numbers. Because if you've been constantly battered down by the people that are calling you pro-Putin for pointing out these hypocrisies and antagonisms, it's very hard to, you know, keep going in a small group. So we have to kind of source out the groups though, and work together on that. Also as well, there's an opportunity here, because they're going to say too, with the Nord Stream and all of these the gas and all of that coming in from Russia, and all that's gone, and there's prices of oil and gas are going to go up, and then the wheat and all that. But industrial relations, going out on the picket lines demanding wage increases, that's an area where we can get in there, and you know, that's an area where we should be pushing at the moment. And it's not looking good on the trade union front. I don't see too much you know, activity yet, like, you know. And the minimum wage, I think there's 20% of people in the south here are, I don't know what it's the figures for the north, but they're considered low paid. They're paid under 12 euros an hour. There is so many of those people there that aren't unionized, you know, that inflation is going up, the price of things are going up, and they were low paid before the inflationary period. Like, so what's it like for them now? I'm actually one of those as well, so, like, you know, I want a pay rise as well. But that's where we need to push in and keep going down that line, like, you know. You know, organizing the anti-war movement with the people that have neither Washington or Moscow, but also trade union movement. They're looking and exposing to, they're going to take over houses as well. And it is, as one of the speakers was saying there, it is very hard. Like, obviously, look at, if people are refugees, they should be, you know, just brought in and given there shouldn't be any of this type of direct provision, and we should be exposing that side of it as well. There's actually, these people in direct provision. This came from Afghanistan and Syria as well. Like, there's, why aren't they given the houses? Why aren't they let work and that? There's so many, so much hypocrisy that we can expose here. So there's an opportunity there as well out of this disaster as well. Anyway, sure, I'll leave it at that anyways.
All right, thanks. So I had a couple of I'll bring Michael in. You just on mute.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Wonderful points. Just want to make a few here myself to reinforce what's already been said a bit. In relation to NATO, there's been a line being pushed by some people on the left, soft left, hard left, so-called, whatever. I think Paul Mason may be one of these. I'm not sure, but certainly some trade unionists, some journalists, and some others pushing that a NATO situation has now arisen, or pro-NATO situation has now arisen in view of the fact that this Russian aggression has been so, whatever you may think of the context, it is the level of state-sponsored violence here means that NATO is virtually the protector, or could be a protector from further attack, etc., and that within a NATO, EU, Euro-Atlanticist environment, that the liberal values still at least afford some sort of, they frame it in terms of civilizational choice, which still affords some degree of political space to organize working people, whereas Europe or a world dominated by Russia, Chinese authoritarianism will have no such space for working people. So that's the way this is framed. So I think there's going to be a big push to encourage states and on a popular level, people to support a NATO expansion. Whether that will include all the neutral states in Europe, I don't know. And how will Russia respond to that is another thing. And also in relation to trade unionism, as Danny was pointing out, and some others, I think there's also a big push. I think there's evidence there's a big push to get people to accept further austerity as part of the price to be paid, in view of the fact that we now have the usual thing, Hitler of the Volga, so to speak. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, Campbell.
I just really to point by with arms from the NATO countries going to Ukraine, it is possible something might say, well, is this fundamentally different from Germany arming the Irish in 1916? What would people say to this?
Okay, that's a short question. So another John wants to come in again. Just on mute, John.
I want to get Yatta out of the hole she's dug herself into about, and it's summed up by an American cartoon I saw this morning that says, we want peace in Ukraine. We flooded the country with arms and we can't think of anything else to do. Right? So the arming of the Ukrainians suggests that peace can come by the Ukrainians defeating Russia, which they're not going to do. That doesn't mean that Russia can't be defeated, but if Russia were defeated, it would be by direct intervention by the NATO powers, right? So it's the road to peace is not giving more arms to the Ukrainians. The road to peace is a ceasefire and a discussion of the demands of the Russians, the needs of the Ukrainians. And, one of the things that we want to focus on here is the hero Zelensky. Because Zelensky keeps saying completely opposite things. He says, well, I'm willing to discuss neutrality. And then he turns around and he says, can we have World War III? I'm all for neutrality. World War III. And when you think that Zelensky was elected as the peace candidate, as the guy who was going to defeat the oligarchs, you sort of have to question what his role actually is and what's going on here. We want peace in Ukraine. That means a ceasefire. It means some negotiation with the Russians. And there's an easy one. The Russians say they want neutrality. Zelensky says he can go along with it. And there's a difficult one, which is the Russians are demanding the annexation of Crimea and the Donbass. And that's clearly, I don't think the Ukrainians should be forced to accept that. But on the other hand, the issue of self-determination for the Donbass would need to be addressed, by referendum, by international observers, something like that. Some way to do that. But that would be the basis of a peace agreement. And that's what, what's been talked about is amping up the war. That's what the Western media are suggesting that we should be doing. We should be having more war. And we want to say, no, we don't want more war. We want the settlement. The Russians haven't been at all shy about explaining what they want. And they wanted it before they invaded, and they want it now. And there were a couple of years to negotiate with them. Again, that's not to excuse their invasion, but there has been this consistent drive to avoid a settlement with Russia. And the only alternative to a settlement with Russia is basically World War III. That's where we would end up. And I think I want to say to Danny, yes, he's dead on. We really, and to Kevin as well, we really, really need an anti-war movement worthy of its name, and we'll have to sort of bend our minds to that fairly quickly.
Okay, so in that round of the discussion, there was quite a few points and questions raised. So again, I'm going to give Kevin a chance to come back on those.
Thanks very much. I mean, this is a really great discussion. I agree very much with what John just said on the point that Jette raised, which is a great point, because it's a real point. It's a real point that comes up in discussion when we try to argue in the real world about these things. I mean, I think the first thing to say is, we, and by that I mean you, me, the international revolutionary socialist movement, doesn't have any arms to give to anybody. So when we're talking about these slogans that some people come up with of arm the Ukrainians, what that boils down to is that the arms companies, the Western major militarist states, should transfer arms, which will be under their command, and they'll be about who uses them and how they're used and the training and so on, into a war zone in order to bring peace. And John made the point very well with his description of the cartoon. I mean, there's a further point as well, which is perhaps a bit less pertinent, a bit less direct in Ireland, but it's certainly direct in Britain and a number of other countries, which is, well, why don't you stop sending arms to Israel, to Saudi Arabia, to be used in all of these other conflicts before you start talking about sending arms somewhere else for another conflict in which you decide to take sides? I mean, it's a really important point, because I think it's starting to cut through a little bit, certainly in Britain, that while all of this is going on, you have the Yemen war taking place, and you also have the consequences of the 20-year-long occupation of Afghanistan and the destruction of the country's infrastructure prior to that over many decades, which is millions of people facing starvation. If we want to do something good that can try to reduce the tensions in the world and also appeal to people in Russia who are faced with wall-to-wall propaganda of the opposite kind from us, their propaganda is, the people in the West really want to, the ordinary people, not just the governments, really want to destroy our way of life, they're hostile to us and so on. If we did something which demonstrated a peaceful purpose globally, then that can have some impact upon, and let's be honest, this has happened in Russia before. A war that's gone wrong for the rulers has led to popular discontent an uprising from below 1905, February 1917, October of 1917 are really important. That's not, of course, what the Western imperialist powers are looking to. They're looking to bleeding the Russian enemy dry and possibly a regime change in Moscow at the end of it, which produces a pro-Western set of oligarchs rather than a national chauvinist pro-Russian set of oligarchs in Moscow. The other point was Campbell's point. Well, what do we say? This is on the weapons question again. What do we say when people say this is no different from Connolly Lee's derising prepared to take weapons from Germany in 1916. Well, of course, it wasn't just Connolly then. I mean, Carson took German weapons for the exact opposite purpose with the Coa Mutiny. But here, was the Irish uprising, the Dublin uprising, a cat's paw, just a product of German imperialism? Absolutely not. Had no planning. Small number of weapons, which had they got through might have made a difference. Really doesn't determine or shape the political leadership of the Easter Rising, both in the Republican and in the Socialist sense, or then following that, a couple of years after that, the ongoing War of Independence and so on. So it's a political question rather than a question of materiel. We saw in Libya, actually, somebody mentioned Gilbert Ashkar in 2011, that the call for Western arms to the rebels actually very, very quickly, and it happened in the space of 2 weeks, turned into the political subordination of the rebels to Western command because NATO was controlling the airspace and so on. Nothing like that happened in 1916, where the German weapons, which didn't get there, were incidental to the whole thing. I mean, just lastly on Danny's point, I think it's early days in terms of what's going to happen with the working class struggle, with the trade union struggle, how things pan out in relation to the war, how long that happens, and so on. I would say this. I mean, I think in terms of the trade unions, let me just say about Britain, because I don't know about Ireland. I mean, it's quite mixed. There are some indications from the unions. Already, the leader of the Unison Union, which is the biggest union, has said terrible statement, her own personal statement, which was, we will have to look at fighting over living standards, but for now we should unite as a nation under the banner of Ukraine, of the blue and gold, the blue and gold flag, which is a terrible position. Her union executive passed an extremely good anti-war position. At the same time, you'll know, because of course it's affecting Ireland, the P&O ferries crisis, there is huge anger amongst people about the mass sackings, there's feelings amongst the trade unionists and so on. But I think we're going to face the things that we always do face. I'd emphasise again, though, basing ourselves on what the massive working class people are saying, particularly those who are really hard hit. I mean, Danny was talking about people on below minimum wage or just at minimum wage, and there are an awful lot of people like that, and they're not going to be satisfied, forever, just by some propaganda about how we're free in the West, unlike those poor people in Russia living under the new Hitler of Putin. I don't think people are going to buy that for that long.
Okay, thanks for that. So we'll just, it's about 25 past 8, so I'm just going to move into one last round of the discussion and then ask Kevin to come back one last time at the end to summarize and address any questions. So we've got an indication from Peter.
Okay, it's been a very interesting discussion and a somewhat different political point of view than I'm usually exposed to in this country. I wanted to say a few things about the U.S. to begin with. First of all, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has been a very great benefit to the U.S. ruling class, because they have been able to pull together to unite in a way that they were having trouble with when there was the fighting between Republicans and Democrats over what to do in an evenly divided Congress, and a lot of dissatisfaction, and the pandemic. So this allows Republicans and Democrats to get together saying, we're going to defend the US and we're going to defend Western civilization against this barbarous intrusion. And it certainly has bailed out Joe Biden, who before the invasion looked in very difficult straits. He was unable to get anything through Congress in a year and seemed like it was unlikely he was going to for the rest of his term, whether it was one or two, because the Republicans are pretty certain to take a majority in one or the other houses in the fall. So legislatively, he was done. He could reverse some of Trump's administrative orders, but he couldn't really make any progress beyond that. And now there's a coming together of both parties saying, we're going to go to war. This is great. I mean, not that we're going to fight Russia directly, but we are going to provide arms and we're going to crush Russia economically. And it's also allowed, at least this is how it looks from here, the US to seemingly get Europe together. Europe has been a real problem for the US because it's sort of like herding cats from the point of view of the US ruling class. They were all going in different directions. And what the US really needs to do is to confront China. And to confront China, it's very difficult for the US because the US economy is so entangled with the Chinese economy. And it's also the US against China alone is, the odds are not that good. But if the US can unite the European Union with the US and Japan and turn all of that against China, it can win fairly easily, or at least that's how they're figuring it. And the invasion of Ukraine has given them a basis to pull Europe together and Japan. And they haven't figured out how to turn this against China, but that certainly is their object. Now, that said, the whole situation is very unstable, as several of the speakers have said. Will Europe stay together against Russia? That's not at all clear. It's certainly not in the interests of European countries to do that. Can this be turned against China? Will the US be willing to disentangle itself from China? That's all very uncertain. And what's going to happen to the working classes in any of these countries? Right now, the inflation on top of the pandemic, the situation is very difficult for people and is going to get worse. Also in the US, there is division. The Republicans are not, some of them, the traditional, are behind confronting Russia, but a lot of the Republican base is not for confronting Russia, and a lot of the Democratic base is not for confronting Russia. So it looks very strong right now compared to what it looked like a month ago for the US ruling class, but it isn't that strong. I want to say a little about the anti-war movement here. There is a sort of campist anti-war movement here. The United National Anti-War Coalition, which is taking anti-NATO positions, but saying nothing really about the invasion. There is the Code Pink group, which is connected, I think, with Stop the War in Britain. And they have a set of demands: stop the war in Ukraine, Russian troops out, no to NATO expansion, which I think can get some traction over a wide set of people. And the US labor against war is now reviving on somewhat that basis. So there is an anti-war movement here. There, of course, there's a lot of rallying around Ukraine, and there's some big demonstrations by the Ukrainian community that are more or less calling for NATO to intervene. But there is the beginning of some resistance to it, and there's a lot of unhappiness. Now, I wanted to come back on just something Yetta said, which I agree with. I think if you take a position of supporting the self-determination of Ukraine and that Ukraine, you're defensist on the Ukrainian side, defeatist on the Russian side. You cannot take a position against arms, but you certainly cannot take a position in favor of NATO sending arms to Ukraine. And what Jette was doing was saying, okay, how do you thread this? And I don't think you can thread it by saying no arms, because you are then in the camp of Putin. You can't though say send arms, because if you do that, you're in the camp of US and NATO imperialism. So I think we need to have a comradely discussion on how do you thread that problem, because it's a very real problem, and at least in the US anti-war movement, that is the central problem, really. What do you do about arms? I'll leave it with that.
Okay, so anyone else want to come in? Yeah, go Roche.
Yeah, I'm just when I want to come in on the question of arms. I think what Kevin says, that the international social movement doesn't have any arms to give. That is true, but that's partly a political failing as well. The decline of the left ideologically, but it's also hampered with the fact that we don't have any. Even if we had all the arms in the world, we don't have anyone to give them to. Who would you give them to in Ukraine? What are the progressive forces in any sort of broad sense of the word? Like Kurdistan, for example, is a very complicated issue, and they ended up allying themselves or sectioning them with the Yanks. But it was a progressive force in sort of broad terms. You don't even have an equivalent of that in Ukraine. So that's one problem. But the other problem is a political problem. Even having a very progressive force or a very progressive group to which you would contribute, or a government that was broadly progressive in some sense of the word, that you could say, we're defending, we believe that these people should be able to defend themselves. We don't have that, right? And it's not just, it's partly the nature of the Ukrainian regime itself, but it's also going back to the question, this is an inter-imperialist war. And in that sense, you can actually oppose the idea of NATO giving arms to one of the sides, right? If you look at the flip side of that, for example, in other struggles of national liberation, even though the Soviets had their own interests, people did actually call for these movements to be armed. We were broadly in favor, not that the Soviets actually did a whole heap, actually, American propaganda notwithstanding, around Vietnam, Nicaragua, El Salvador, and other parts of the world. So, part of the problem with this question of arms is there's no one progressive that you would give them to, even if we had them. And the idea of NATO arming and getting involved in a conflict, we should always oppose it. There is no humanitarian thing. It's not, and this goes back, and there's been some debate as well on various Facebook pages around Trotsky's calls in relation to arms shipments from Mussolini, etc., to, I think it was Algeria and stuff like that, right? The whole point was NATO supplying arms is not just simply arms going to a progressive government. It's about arms going to a government which is completely reactionary. And that's, there is no progressive force within the Ukrainian state, and certainly not within the Ukrainian government.
Okay, I had an indication from Dave.
Hello. It makes me this support for this is a great opposition to Putin, which is completely understandable. It does remind you of other conflicts, especially something like the First World War, where typically the forces of the left, what was then, I suppose, the Second International, things like the SPD in Germany, all across Europe. Most of the left supported Germany. Germany was, maybe not. They supported the war effort. If you were in Germany or if in Britain, it was just like a mass patriotism that Germany had violated. When they invaded, when they decided to start invading countries and things like that. It's very similar, and obviously there's a lot of pressure on people to say, who's in the wrong, who's in the right, and ultimately it comes down to a system which socialists don't support. These are, and this is the same in Russia. This is a war between, it's the capitalist powers, and Ukraine are the country in the middle who are basically, the victims of this. But that doesn't mean you support, you support NATO forces and everybody's saying, Ukraine has been terribly wronged, and we must support Ukraine. That's not really. That's the sort of argument that socialists try to avoid, and also as this conflict continues, it'll become more and more obvious that you have to have a critical standpoint. You don't just say, we must support Ukraine against this aggression. And also, I agree that weapons to Ukraine, I absolutely want Russia to be ejected from Ukraine, but at the same time, it's like you can't just support NATO weapons. It's like, yeah, you agree with the idea that Ukrainians need to be armed against such aggression, in the absence of some sort of negotiated settlement. But we really can't. We can't just support NATO weapons. NATO forces. That's just ABC. You don't do that. You don't support that.
All right, thanks for that. So I've had another indication. So Michael, you want to come in again?
Yeah, just briefly. It is a very tricky one, guys. So some on the Ukrainian left have written openly about, while they understand the trepidation about arming the Ukrainian state as such, but they do welcome any attempts by people to help for people, the Ukrainian army, Ukrainian communities, in some cases civilians are helping in the defense of their neighborhoods, because they're being pulverized, Okay, thanks.
Okay, thanks. So I'm just going to draw the discussion part to the close, but